After an absence of a little more than a week, the Marquis de la Tour-d'Azur was back in his place on the right side of the National Assembly. Properly speaking, we should refer to him as the former Marquis de la Tour-d'Azur. The time was September of 1790. This was 2 months after the downright Breton leveler Le Chapelier had proposed a new decree. The decree stated that nobility should no more be hereditary than infamy. It argued that just as the brand of the gallows must not defile the worthy descendants of a convicted criminal, the blazon of achievement should not glorify the unworthy descendants of a good man. So the decree had passed. It abolished hereditary nobility and threw family escutcheons onto the rubbish heap of things that an enlightened generation of philosophers would no longer tolerate. The Count de Lafayette had supported the motion and left the assembly as plain Mr. Motier. The great tribune Count Mirabeau became plain Mr. Riquetti. The Marquis de la Tour-d'Azur became just simple Mr. Lesarques. They had done this during one of those moments of high excitement caused by the approach of the great national festival of the Champ de Mars. No doubt many who had supported it thoroughly repented their decision the very next day. So, although it was now a law, no one bothered to enforce it just yet. That is beside the point. As I said, the time was September. The day was dull and showery. Some of the damp and gloom seemed to have penetrated the long hall of the Manège. Here, 800 or 900 representatives of the 3 orders that composed the nation sat on 8 rows of green benches. The benches were arranged in ascending elliptical tiers around the space known as la piste. The Constitution builders were debating whether the deliberating body to succeed the Constituent Assembly should work in conjunction with the king. They also debated whether it should be periodic or permanent, and whether it should govern by 2 chambers or by 1. The Abbé Maury was the son of a cobbler. In these days of extreme contrasts, he was the chief orator of the party of the right. These men were known as the Blacks, and they fought the losing battles of privilege. The Abbé Maury was in the tribune. He appeared to be urging the adoption of a 2-chamber system framed on the English model. He was even more long-winded and boring than usual. His arguments sounded more and more like a sermon. The tribune of the National Assembly became more and more like a pulpit. Conversely, the members looked less and less like a congregation. They grew restless under his steady flow of pompous words. For ushers with carefully powdered heads wore black satin breeches, chains of office on their breasts, and gilded swords at their sides. They circulated in the piste, clapped their hands, and hissed in vain. They cried,
"Silence! Take your seats!"
The president at his green-covered table, facing the tribune, intermittently rang his bell. This was equally useless. The Abbé Maury had talked too long and had failed to interest the members for some time. He finally realized this and stopped speaking. The hum of conversation became general. Then it fell abruptly. There was a silence of expectancy as heads turned and necks craned. Even the group of secretaries at the round table below the president's dais roused themselves from their usual apathy. They wanted to consider this young man who was mounting the tribune of the assembly for the first time. The announcer called out,
"Mr. André-Louis Moreau, substitute deputy, replacing the deceased Emmanuel Lagron for Ancinous in the Department of the Loire."
The Marquis de la Tour-d'Azur shook himself out of his gloomy abstraction. He felt a grim interest in the successor of the deputy he had slain. You can imagine how his interest heightened when he heard the name. He looked across the room and recognized this André-Louis Moreau. This was the young scoundrel who was continually crossing his path. He was continually exerting a deep, sinister influence against the Marquis. This young man made the Marquis regret sparing his life that day at Gavrillac 2 years ago. The fact that he had stepped into the shoes of Lagron seemed too fitting to be a mere coincidence. It felt like a direct challenge in itself. He looked at the young man in wonder rather than in anger. As he looked, he was filled by a vague and premonitory uneasiness. The young man's presence was a challenge in itself, and he demonstrated this in clear terms right from the start. André-Louis began.
"I come before you as a substitute deputy to fill the place of a man who was murdered some 3 weeks ago."
It was a challenging opening. It instantly provoked an indignant outcry from the blacks. André-Louis paused and looked at them. He smiled a little as a singularly self-confident young man. He continued.
Mr. President, the gentlemen of the right do not appear to like my words. That is not surprising. The gentlemen of the right notoriously do not like the truth.
This time there was an uproar. The members of the left roared with laughter. The members of the right thundered menacingly. The ushers circulated faster than usual. They grew agitated, clapped their hands, and called in vain for silence. The president rang his bell. The voice of La Tour d'Azur rose above the general din. He had half risen from his seat and shouted,
Mountebank, this is not the theater.
André-Louis answered.
No, sir. It is becoming a hunting ground for bully swordsmen.
The uproar grew. The substitute deputy looked around and waited. He saw the encouraging grin of Lou Chapelier nearby. He also saw the quiet and approving smile of Cursain, another Breton deputy of his acquaintance. A little farther off, he saw the great head of Mirabeau thrown back. Mirabeau's great eyes looked at him from under a frown in a sort of wonder. Yonder, among the moving sea of faces, he spotted the sallow face of the lawyer from Arras. This was Robespierre, or de Robespierre as the little snob now called himself. He had assumed the aristocratic particle as the prerogative of a man of his distinction in the councils of his country. The deputy for Arras had his tip-tilted nose in the air and his carefully curled head on one side. He was observing André-Louis attentively. He had thrust the horn-rimmed spectacles he used for reading up onto his pale forehead. He considered the speaker through a leveled spyglass. His thin-lipped mouth stretched a little in that tiger-cat smile that would later become so famous and feared. Gradually, the uproar wore itself out. It diminished enough so that the president could make himself heard. He leaned forward and gravely addressed the young man in the tribune. The president said,
Sir, if you wish to be heard, let me beg of you not to be provocative in your language.
He then turned to the others and added,
Gentlemen, if we are to proceed, I beg that you will restrain your feelings until the substitute deputy has concluded his discourse.
André-Louis replied,
I shall endeavor to obey, Mr. President. I will leave provocation to the gentlemen of the right. If the few words I have used so far have been provocative, I regret it. But it was necessary for me to refer to the distinguished deputy whose place I come so unworthily to fill. It was also unavoidable that I refer to the event that has procured us this sad necessity. The deputy Lagron was a man of singular nobility of mind. He was a selfless, dutiful, and zealous man. He was inflamed by the high purpose of doing his duty by his electors and by this assembly. He possessed what his opponents would call a dangerous gift of eloquence.
La Tour d'Azur writhed at the well-known phrase. It was his own phrase. He had used it to explain his action in the matter of Philippe de Vilmorin. This was the phrase that people had cast in his teeth from time to time with vindictive menace. Then the crisp voice of the witty Canales cut sharply into the speaker's momentary pause. Canales was the rapier of the privileged party. He asked with great solemnity,
Mr. President, has the substitute deputy mounted the tribune to take part in the debate on the constitution of the legislative assemblies, or to pronounce a funeral oration upon the departed deputy Lagron?
This time the blacks gave way to mirth, until the substitute deputy checked them. He declared,
That laughter is obscene.
He flung his glove into the face of privilege in a truly Gallic fashion. He was determined to take no half measures. The rippling laughter perished instantly and was quenched in speechless fury. He proceeded solemnly. He continued,
You all know how Lagron died. To refer to his death at all requires courage. To laugh while referring to it requires something that I will not attempt to qualify. If I have alluded to his decease, it is because my appearance among you seemed to render some such allusion necessary. It is my duty to take up the burden that he set down. I do not pretend that I have the strength, the courage, or the wisdom of Lagron, but I will bear that burden with every ounce of strength, courage, and wisdom that I possess. I trust that the means taken to impose silence upon that eloquent voice will not be taken to impose silence upon mine, for the sake of those who might attempt it.
There was a faint murmur of applause from the left. There was a splutter of contemptuous laughter from the right. A voice called out to him.
Rhodamont.
He looked in the direction of the voice. It came from the group of hired swordsmen among the blacks across the piste. He smiled. His lips answered inaudibly. He mouthed.
No, my friend. I am Scaramouche. I am the subtle, dangerous fellow who goes tortuously to his ends.
He resumed aloud.
Mr. President, some people will not understand that our purpose here is to make laws by which France may be equitably governed. These laws must lift France out of the morass of bankruptcy into which she is in danger of sinking. But it seems some people want blood instead of laws. I solemnly warn them that this blood will end by choking them if they do not learn in time to discard force and allow reason to prevail.
Once again, there was something in that phrase that stirred a memory in La Tour d'Azur. He turned in the fresh uproar to speak to his cousin Chamberlain, who sat beside him. He said,
This bastard of Gavrillac is a daring rogue.
Chamberlain looked at him with gleaming eyes. His face was white with anger. He replied,
Let him talk himself out. I do not think he will be heard again after today. Leave this to me.
La Tour could hardly tell you why, but he sank back in his seat with a sense of relief. He had been telling himself that this matter demanded action. It was a challenge he had to take up. Despite his rage, he felt a singular unwillingness to act. This fellow had a trick of reminding him too unpleasantly of that young abbé done to death in the garden behind the Breton Inn at Gavrillac. The death of Philippe de Vilmorin did not lie heavily on the Marquis de La Tour d'Azur's conscience. He believed his action was fully justified, but his memory revived an unpleasant picture. He remembered that distraught boy kneeling over the bleeding body of the friend he had loved. The boy had almost begged to be slain with him, calling the Marquis a murderer and a coward to incite him. Meanwhile, the substitute deputy left the subject of the death of Lagron. He brought himself into order and began speaking upon the question under debate. He contributed nothing of value to it. He urged nothing definite. His speech on the subject was very brief. This debate was merely the pretext, not the purpose, for ascending the tribune. Later, he left the hall at the end of the sitting with Le Chapelier at his side. He found himself densely surrounded by deputies who acted as a bodyguard. Most of them were Bretons. They aimed to screen him from the provocations his own words in the assembly would surely bring down upon his head. For a moment, the massive form of Mirabeau appeared alongside him. The great man said,
Congratulations, Mr. Moreau. You acquitted yourself very well. They will want your blood, no doubt. But be discreet, sir, if I may presume to advise you. Do not allow yourself to be misled by any false sense of quixotry. Ignore their challenges. I do so myself. I place each challenger upon my list. There are some 50 there already, and there they will remain. Refuse them what they call satisfaction, and all will be well.
André-Louis smiled and sighed. The hypocrite said,
It requires courage.
Mirabeau replied,
Of course it does, but you seem to have plenty.
André-Louis responded,
Hardly enough, perhaps, but I shall do my best.
They had come through the vestibule. It was lined with eager blacks waiting for the young man who had insulted them so flagrantly from the rostrum. However, André-Louis's bodyguard had prevented any of them from reaching him. They emerged into the open under the great awning at the head of the carrière. This awning was erected to let carriages reach the door under cover. The people in front of him dispersed a little. As he reached the edge of the awning, his front was entirely uncovered for a moment. Outside, the rain was falling heavily and churning the ground into thick mud. André-Louis hesitated to step out into the deluge for a moment, with Le Chapelier ever at his side. The watchful Chamberlain had seen his chance. He made a detour momentarily out into the rain and came face to face with the daring young Breton. He rudely and violently thrust André-Louis back, as if to make room for himself under the shelter. André-Louis was not under any delusion about the man's deliberate purpose for a second. Neither were the people standing near him. They made a belated and ineffectual attempt to close around him. André-Louis was grievously disappointed. It was not Chamberlain he had been expecting. His disappointment showed on his face. The arrogant chevalier mistook it for something very different. But if Chaberlain was the man appointed to deal with him, André-Louis would make the best of it. He said very civilly.
I think you are pushing against me, sir.
He used his elbow and shoulder to thrust Mr. de Chaberlain back into the ring. The Chevalier bullied.
I desire to take shelter, sir.
André-Louis replied.
You may do so without standing on my feet. I have a prejudice against anyone standing on my feet. My feet are very tender. Perhaps you did not know it, sir. Please say no more.
The Chevalier exclaimed, slightly flustered.
Why, I wasn't speaking, you lout.
André-Louis responded.
Were you not? I thought perhaps you were about to apologize.
Chaberlain laughed and said,
Apologize? To you? Do you know that you are amusing?
He stepped under the awning for the second time and thrust André-Louis rudely back in view of everyone. André-Louis cried out with a grimace.
Ah, you hurt me, sir. I have told you not to push against me.
He raised his voice so everyone might hear him. He pushed Mr. de Chaberlain back into the rain once more. Despite his slenderness, André-Louis's assiduous daily sword practice had given him an arm of iron. He also threw his weight into the thrust. His assailant reeled backwards a few steps. His heel struck a large piece of timber left on the ground by some workmen that morning. He sat down suddenly in the mud. A roar of laughter rose from all who witnessed the fine gentleman's downfall. He rose in a fury, covered in mud. In that fury, he sprang at André-Louis. André-Louis had made him ridiculous. This was completely unforgivable. He sputtered.
You shall meet me for this. I shall kill you for it.
His inflamed face was within a foot of André-Louis's face. André-Louis laughed. In the silence, everybody heard the laugh and the words that followed. André-Louis said,
Oh, is that what you wanted? But why didn't you say so before? You would have spared me the trouble of knocking you down. I thought gentlemen of your profession invariably conducted these affairs with decency, decorum, and a certain grace. Had you done so, you might have saved your breeches.
Chaberlain snapped, livid with very real fury.
How soon shall we settle this?
André-Louis was suavity itself. He replied,
Whenever you please, sir. It is for you to say when it will suit your convenience to kill me. I think that was the intention you announced, was it not?
Chaberlain said,
Tomorrow morning in the Bois. Perhaps you will bring a friend.
André-Louis responded,
Certainly, sir. Tomorrow morning, then. I hope we shall have fine weather. I detest the rain.
Chaberlain looked at him almost with amazement. André-Louis smiled pleasantly. He said,
Don't let me detain you now, sir. We quite understand each other. I shall be in the Bois at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning.
Chaberlain replied,
That is too late for me, sir.
André-Louis said,
Any other hour would be too early for me. I do not like to have my habits disturbed. 9 o'clock or not at all, as you please.
Chaberlain argued,
But I must be at the assembly at 9 for the morning session.
André-Louis responded,
I am afraid you will have to kill me first, sir. I have a prejudice against being killed before 9 o'clock.
This was too complete a subversion of the usual procedure for Mr. de Chaberlain's stomach. Here was a rustic deputy assuming the precise tone of sinister mockery that his class usually dealt out to victims from the Third Estate. To heighten the irritation, André-Louis acted like Scaramouche always did. He produced his snuff-box and proffered it with a steady hand to Le Chapelier before helping himself. It seemed Chaberlain was not even allowed to make a good exit after all he had suffered. He said,
Very well, sir. 9 o'clock, then. We will see if you talk as pertly afterwards.
On that note, he flung himself away before the jeers of the provincial deputies. It did not soothe his rage to be laughed at by urchins all the way down the Rue Dauphine. They laughed because of the mud and filth that dripped from his satin breeches and the tails of his elegant, striped coat. The members of the Third Estate jeered on the surface. Underneath, however, they trembled with fear and indignation. It was too much. Lagron had been killed by one of these bullies. Now his successor was challenged and about to be killed by another of them on the very first day of his appearance. Several deputies came to implore André-Louis not to go to the Bois. They asked him to ignore the challenge and the whole affair. They believed it was a deliberate attempt to put him out of the way. He listened seriously, shook his head gloomily, and finally promised to think it over. He was in his seat again for the afternoon session, as if nothing disturbed him. When the assembly met the next morning, his place was vacant. Mr. de Chabrolain's place was also vacant. Gloom and resentment sat upon the members of the Third Estate. It brought a more acrid note than usual into their debates. They disapproved of the rashness of their new recruit. Some openly condemned his lack of caution. Very few expected to see him again, and those were only the little group in Le Chapelier's confidence. Therefore, it was with as much amazement as relief that they saw him enter a few minutes after 10. He was calm, composed, and bland as he threaded his way to his seat. The speaker occupying the rostrum at that moment was a member of the privileged party. He stopped short and stared in incredulous dismay. Here was something he could not understand at all. Then, from somewhere, a voice explained the phenomenon contemptuously to satisfy the amazement on both sides of the assembly. The voice said,
"They haven't met. He shirked it at the last moment."
Everyone thought it must be so. The mystification ceased, and men were settling back into their seats. André-Louis reached his place and heard the voice that explained the matter to universal satisfaction. He paused before taking his seat. He felt it incumbent upon him to reveal the true fact. André-Louis declared,
"Mr. President, please accept my excuses for my late arrival."
There was no necessity for this. It was a mere piece of theatricality, but Scaramouche could not forego it. He continued,
"I have been detained by an engagement of a pressing nature. I also bring you the excuses of Mr. de Chabrolain. Unfortunately, he will be permanently absent from this assembly in the future."
The silence was complete. André-Louis sat down. Chapter 8. The Paladin of the Third. The Chevalier de Chabrolain had been closely connected, you will remember, with the wicked affair that cost Philippe de Villemur his life. We know enough to guess that he had not merely been La Tour d'Azur's second in that duel, actually an instigator of the whole business. André-Louis may therefore have felt a justifiable satisfaction in offering up the Chevalier's life to the memory of his murdered friend. He likely viewed it as an act of common justice that could not be achieved by any other means. We must also remember that Chabrolain had gone confidently to the duel, believing that as a practiced swordsman, he was dealing with a bourgeois utterly unskilled in fencing. Morally, then, he was little better than a murderer. The fact that he tumbled into the very pit he thought he had dug for André-Louis was poetic justice. Still, despite all this, I would find the cynical tone with which André-Louis announced the outcome to the assembly utterly detestable, if I believed it was sincere. It would justify Aileen's opinion, shared by so many others who had come into close contact with him, that André-Louis was completely heartless. You have seen a similar heartlessness in his conduct when he discovered La Benet's betrayal, although the steps he took to avenge himself contradict that idea. I believe his subsequent contempt for the woman was born of the genuine affection he once had for her. I do not believe that this affection was as deep as he first imagined, but I also do not believe it was as shallow as he tried to make it appear, given how thoroughly he pretended to banish her from his mind after discovering her true nature. His actions certainly do not support that claim. Furthermore, his callous cynicism in hoping he had killed Benet is also an act. Knowing that creatures like Benet are better off dead, he could have felt no remorse. He possessed, you must remember, a rare level-headedness that saw things in their true proportions, never magnifying or shrinking them out of sentimentality. At the same time, it is simply incredible that he could contemplate taking a life with such complete, cynical calmness, no matter the justification. Similarly, it is hard to believe that coming straight from the Bois de Boulogne, straight from killing a man, he would sincerely express his true nature by announcing the deed with such outrageous flippancy. He was not quite the incarnation of Scaramouche to that extent. However, he was definitely prone to masking his true feelings behind a dramatic gesture and hiding his real thoughts with a clever phrase. He was always the actor. He constantly calculated the effect he would produce, always avoiding true self-revelation, and always striving to cover his real character with a fake, assumed persona. This behavior contained a touch of mischievousness, along with other, more complex motives. Nobody laughed at his flippancy now. He never intended for anyone to laugh. He meant to be terrifying, and he knew that the more casual and flippant his tone, the more terrifying the effect would be. He produced exactly the result he desired. What happened next, in a place where emotions and political tactics had become so extreme, is not hard to guess. When the session ended, a dozen hired duelists were waiting for him in the lobby. This time, the men of his own party were less concerned about guarding him. He seemed completely capable of guarding himself. Despite his usual caution, he appeared to have taken the war directly into the enemy's camp and fully adopted their own brutal methods. Consequently, his allies hardly felt the need to protect him as they had the day before. As he walked out, he scanned the hostile line of men, whose attitudes and clothes clearly marked them for what they were. He paused, looking for the specific man he expected, the man he most wanted to accommodate. But the Marquis de la Tour d'Azyr was missing from those eager ranks. This struck André-Louis as odd. La Tour d'Azyr was Chaberlain's cousin and closest friend. Surely he should have been the first one there today. The truth was that La Tour d'Azyr was overwhelmed by shock and grief at the completely unexpected turn of events. Furthermore, his usual thirst for revenge was strangely held in check. Perhaps he, too, remembered Chaberlain's role in the Gavrillac tragedy. Perhaps he saw an ordained avenger in this obscure André-Louis Moreau, who had relentlessly persecuted him ever since. The reluctance he felt to force a confrontation, especially after this ultimate provocation, puzzled even the Marquis himself. But that reluctance existed, and it held him back now. Since La Tour d'Azyr was not part of that waiting pack, it mattered little to André-Louis who would be next on that Tuesday morning. As it happened, the next man was the young Vicomte de la Montreal, one of the deadliest swordsmen in the group. On Wednesday morning, arriving an hour or so late to the assembly, André-Louis made another announcement. Using much the same tone he had used to report Chaberlain's death, he stated that Monsieur de la Montreal would probably not disturb the harmony of the assembly for several weeks. That is, assuming the Vicomte was lucky enough to eventually recover from an unpleasant accident he had quite unexpectedly met with that morning. On Thursday, he made an identical announcement regarding the Vidame de Blaven. On Friday, he told the assembly that he had been delayed by Monsieur de Troiscantins. Then, turning to the members of the right wing and stretching his face into a mask of sympathetic gravity, he added a final note.
I am glad to inform you, gentlemen, that Monsieur de Troiscantins is in the hands of a very competent surgeon. With proper care, the doctor hopes to restore him to your counsels in a few weeks' time.
It was paralyzing, fantastic, and surreal. Friend and foe alike in that assembly sat stunned by those bland, daily announcements. For of the most fearsome hired swordsmen had been put out of action, and one of them was dead. All of this had been accomplished with an air of total indifference and announced in the most casual terms by a wretched little provincial lawyer. In their eyes, he began to take on a romantic, legendary quality. Even the group of left-wing philosophers, who refused to worship any power other than reason, began to view him with a respect and admiration that no brilliant speech could ever have earned him. From the assembly, his fame slowly seeped out across Paris. Desmoulins wrote a glowing tribute to him in his newspaper,
Less revolutions.
dubbing him the
Paladin of the Third Estate.
The name captured the public's imagination and stuck with him for quite some time. He was mentioned disdainfully in the
Axe de Poders.
the mocking newspaper of the privileged party. That publication was lightheartedly and aggressively edited by a group of noblemen suffering from a severe case of political short-sightedness. Friday marked the end of a very busy week for this young man, who even then continued to insist that he was in no way a man of action. As he casually and expectantly walked out of the manège with Le Chapelier and Cursain, he found the lobby entirely empty of swordsmen. He was so surprised that he stopped dead in his tracks.
Have they had enough?
He wondered aloud. directing the question to Le Chapelier.
They have had enough of you, I should think.
Le Chapelier replied.
They will probably prefer to turn their attention to someone less capable of defending himself.
This was disappointing news. André-Louis had thrown himself into this dangerous game with a very specific goal in mind. Killing Chaberlain had been satisfying enough, as far as it went. He had considered it an acceptable appetizer. But the 3 men who followed were not his real targets at all. He had fought them with a certain amount of reluctance, dealing with each one as lightly as his own safety would allow. Was the harassment going to stop now, before the man he truly wanted had even shown his face? If so, he would have to force the issue. Outside under the awning, a group of noblemen stood locked in intense conversation. Scanning the group with a quick glance, André-Louis spotted the Marquis de la Tour d'Azur among them. He tightened his lips. He could not be the one to provoke a fight directly. They had to be the ones to force a quarrel upon him. The
Axe de Poters
had already torn away his mask that morning, revealing to the world that he was the fencing master of the Rue du Hazard and the successor to Bertrand d'Aramis. It was already incredibly dangerous for a man of his social class to engage in single combat. This public exposure, offered as an excuse for the aristocrat's failures, made his position doubly hazardous. Still, he could not leave things as they were, or all his efforts would have been for nothing. Carefully looking away from the group of gentlemen, he raised his voice so his words would carry clearly to their ears.
It begins to look as if my fears of having to spend the rest of my days dueling in the Bois were pointless.
Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the stir his words caused in the group. The men turned to look at him, but for the moment, that was all. A little more prodding was necessary. Pacing slowly between his friends, he spoke again.
But isn't it remarkable that the assassin of Lagron makes no move against Lagron's successor? Or perhaps it isn't remarkable at left. Perhaps there are good reasons. Perhaps the gentleman is just being prudent.
He had walked past the group by now. He let that last sentence trail behind him and followed it with a burst of loud, insulting laughter. He did not have to wait long. Quick footsteps sounded behind him, and a hand clamped heavily onto his shoulder, spinning him violently around. He found himself face to face with the Marquis de la Tour d'Azur. The nobleman's handsome face was pale and composed, but his eyes blazed with sudden, uncontrollable anger. Behind him, several members of his group were approaching more cautiously. The others, like André-Louis' 2 companions, simply stood and watched.
You spoke of me, I think.
The Marquis said quietly.
I spoke of an assassin, yes, but I was speaking to my friends here.
André-Louis' manner was just as quiet. In fact, he was the calmer of the 2, playing the role of the more experienced actor.
You spoke loudly enough to be overheard.
The Marquis replied, addressing the implication that he had been eavesdropping.
Those who want to overhear usually find a way to do so. I see that your goal is to be offensive. Oh, you are quite mistaken, Monsieur le Marquis. I have no desire to be offensive, but I do resent having hands violently laid upon me, especially when I cannot consider those hands to be clean. Under the circumstances, you can hardly expect me to be polite.
The older man's eyelids twitched. He almost caught himself admiring André-Louis' composed posture. More importantly, he feared his own behavior might look worse by comparison. This realization enraged him entirely, and he lost all control.
You called me the assassin of Lagron. I won't pretend to misunderstand you. You explained your views to me once before, and I remember them well. I am flattered that you remember, monsieur. You called me an assassin then, because I used my skill to eliminate a violent hothead who made the world unsafe for me. But how are you any better, Mr. Fencing Master, when you fight men whose skill is naturally far inferior to your own?
The Marquis friends looked serious and disturbed. It was truly unbelievable to see this great nobleman forget himself so completely. He was actually sinking to the level of arguing with a low-born fencing lawyer. Worse still, it was an argument he was clearly losing, making himself look ridiculous in the process.
I fight them?
André-Louis said, his tone full of amused protest.
Ah, Forgive me, Monsieur le Marquis. They are the ones who chose to fight me, and very stupidly at that. They shove me, they slap my face, they step on my toes, and they call me vile names. So what if I am a fencing master? Does that mean I must silently accept every kind of abuse from your ill-mannered friends? Perhaps if they had discovered I was a fencing master sooner, their manners would have improved. But to blame me for their stupidity, what an injustice! Comedian.
The Marquis spat contemptuously.
Does that change the facts? Are these men who challenged you professional swordsmen who live by the blade like you do? On the contrary, Monsieur le Marquis, I have found them to be men who die by the blade with astonishing ease. I cannot imagine you want to join their ranks. And why is that, if you please?
La Tour d'Azur's face flushed bright red at the sneer.
Oh.
André-Louis raised his eyebrows and pursed his lips, pretending to think it over. He delivered his answer slowly.
Because, monsieur, you prefer easy victims. You prefer the Lagrans and Vilmerins of this world. Mere sheep for your butchery. That is why.
And then, the Marquis struck him across the face. André-Louis stepped back. His eyes flashed for a second. The next moment, he was smiling up into the face of his tall enemy.
You are no better than the others, after all. Well, well. Notice, I beg you, how history repeats itself with a few small differences. Because poor Vilmerin could not bear a vile lie you used to taunt him, he struck you. Because you cannot bear an equally vile truth I have spoken, you strike me. But the vileness is always yours. And now, just as it was back then, the penalty for striking a blow is...
He paused.
But why even name it? You know what it is. You wrote the rules yourself that day, with the point of your overly eager sword. But very well. I will meet you if you desire it, monsieur. What else do you think I desire? To talk?
André-Louis turned to his friends and let out a tired sigh.
It seems I am to take another trip to the Bois. Isaac, perhaps you will kindly have a word with one of the Marquis friends and arrange things for 9 o'clock tomorrow, as usual. Not tomorrow.
The Marquis said sharply to Le Chapelier.
I have a prior engagement in the country that I cannot postpone.
Le Chapelier looked questioningly at André-Louis.
Then, to accommodate Monsieur le Marquis, we will say Sunday at the same hour. I do not fight on Sunday. I am not a pagan who breaks the holy day. Surely the good Lord would not presume to damn a gentleman of your high quality over such a small detail? Ah, well, Isaac, please arrange it for Monday, assuming it isn't a feast day or monsieur hasn't scheduled another pressing engagement. I leave it in your capable hands.
He bowed with the weary air of a man bored by tedious details, looped his arm through Cursain's, and walked away.
Good God, you certainly have a knack for this,
said the Breton deputy, who was completely unfamiliar with the subtle arts of dueling.
I certainly do. I have taken lessons from the very best.
André-Louis laughed. He was in an excellent mood, and from that moment on, Cursain joined the ranks of those who considered André-Louis a man entirely without a heart or a conscience. But in his
Confessions,
André-Louis reveals the truth. This is one of those rare glimpses that shows the real man hiding beneath all the make-believe. He writes that on that very night, he fell to his knees to speak with his dead friend Philippe. He called upon his friend's spirit to witness that he was finally about to take the last step in fulfilling the oath he had sworn over Philippe's body at Gavrillac 2 long years ago.